I found out I was truly alone the day I got sick and no one came to see me, not even my own son. I remember sitting at the edge of my bed that morning, my hands resting on my lap as the sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin, quiet lines, the kind of light that used to feel warm, but now only made the silence more noticeable. I had called Jason the night before, my voice steady, as I told him the doctor wanted me to rest, maybe even stay overnight for observation. He said he would call back. He never did. I did not call again. I just waited the way mothers do, convincing myself there must be a reason, something important, something unavoidable. But morning came and the phone stayed still. No messages, no missed calls, no one at the door. I made my own breakfast, though I barely touched it. A piece of toast sat cold on the plate as I watched the clock tick forward, each second stretching longer than the last. I checked my phone again. Nothing. I set it down carefully as if sudden movement might change something. It did not. I walked slowly through the house, passing by framed photos of birthdays, holidays, quiet moments that once meant something more. I paused in the hallway where Jason used to stand as a boy, waiting for me to tie his shoes, and for a brief moment, I let myself remember what it felt like to be needed, truly needed, not just tolerated, not just expected to be there, but wanted. I exhaled softly and kept walking, because memory does not change the present, and the present was clear. They were not coming, not today, maybe not at all. I sat by the window in the living room later that afternoon, the same place I had spent years reading or watching the neighborhood pass by. But this time I was not watching for comfort. I was watching for proof that maybe I was wrong, that maybe a car would pull into the driveway, that maybe the door would open, and I would hear his voice calling out to me the way he used to when he still saw this house as home. But the street remained quiet. The hours passed, and with each one something inside me settled, not broke, not shattered, just settled into place like a truth I had been avoiding for far too long. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a choice. And once I understood that, everything else became clearer. I stood up slowly and turned away from the window, my reflection catching briefly in the glass, a woman standing alone in a house she had built for others, who no longer felt the need to return. I did not cry. I did not reach for the phone again. Instead, I walked toward the hallway and into my room, opening the small drawer beside my bed where the documents had been resting untouched for years. I did not take them out, not yet. I simply placed my hand on top of them and allowed myself a quiet thought. They had already decided I was no longer part of their lives. What they did not realize was that I had already prepared for that decision long before they ever made it. I did not go back to bed after that. Instead, I stayed in the living room as the afternoon slowly turned into evening. The light outside shifting from pale gold to a deeper shade that stretched shadows across the floor. I did not turn on the television. I did not play music. I simply sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the quiet settle into every corner of the house, the kind of quiet that does not feel peaceful, but empty, like something important has been removed and nothing has taken its place. I reached for my phone once more, not because I expected anything to change, but because habit is hard to break. I unlocked the screen and stared at it for a moment, my reflection faintly visible over the blank space where notifications should have been. I thought about sending a message, just a simple one, asking if everything was all right, but I stopped myself halfway through typing because I already knew the answer. Everything was all right for them. It was just not all right for me, and that difference mattered more than anything. I set the phone down again and leaned back into the chair, my eyes drifting toward the ceiling as I let my thoughts move freely for the first time, without trying to excuse anything or soften it. I remembered the last time Jason had visited. It had been brief. He stood near the doorway instead of coming fully inside, his phone in his hand, his attention divided. Melissa had called him twice. While he was there, I could hear her voice through the speaker light, but sharp, reminding him about errands, about plans, about time, and he had left before his coffee had even cooled. At the time, I told myself it was normal, that life was busy, that young couples had their own priorities, but sitting there now, I could see it differently. It had not been urgency. It had been distance, something that had been growing slowly over time. While I chose not to name it, I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, opening the cabinet where I kept the cups. My hand hovered for a moment before selecting one, the same one Jason used to prefer when he still lived here, blue with a thin white rim. I filled it with water and held it for a second before setting it back down, untouched. The gesture felt unnecessary, like holding on to something that no longer belonged to the present. I moved through the house again, this time more deliberately, noticing things I had overlooked before, the way certain drawers had been reorganized, the way a few items were no longer where I had left them. Small changes, subtle, but intentional signs that decisions had been made without me included. I paused in the hallway and let that realization settle fully. This was not just about absence, this was about replacement, a quiet reshaping of my place in a life I had built. I returned to the living room and sat down once more, my posture straight, my breathing steady, and for the first time since the night before I allowed myself to stop waiting completely, not for a call, not for a visit, not for an explanation. The waiting was over, and in its place was something else, something clearer, something colder. I reached for the small drawer beside the chair and opened it slowly. This time, I did take the documents out, the paper smooth beneath my fingers as I placed them carefully on the table in front of me. I did not read them, yet I did not need to. I already knew what they contained. What mattered was not what was written, but what it meant. I sat there in the quiet with those papers resting within reach and realized something simple but undeniable. They had stepped away when I needed them most, and in doing so they had revealed exactly who they were, and more importantly, they had confirmed exactly what I had prepared for long before they ever made that choice. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was in pain, but because my mind had finally stopped protecting me from the truth. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same sound I had heard for years, but now it felt different, like it was no longer filled with life, but with absence. I turned onto my side and looked at the empty space beside me, a space that used to feel shared even when I was alone, because there was always the belief that someone would return, that someone still cared enough to come back. But that belief was gone now, and in its place was something clearer, something harder to ignore. I closed my eyes for a moment and let my thoughts move backward, not to comfort myself, but to understand when exactly things had started to change. I remembered the holidays that slowly became shorter, the visits that turned into quick stops at the door, the calls that felt rushed, as if I was interrupting something more important. I remembered the way Melissa would stand just slightly behind Jason when they visited, her hand lightly touching his arm, not affectionate, but guiding, subtle, but constant, as if she was always steering the direction of his attention. I remembered the way he would glance at her before answering simple questions, the way his tone would shift depending on her presence, things I had noticed before but never truly questioned, because I trusted him, because I believed that whatever distance existed could not possibly be intentional. I sat up slowly, the room still dim, with the early morning light just beginning to filter through the curtains, and I realized that it had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, careful, almost unnoticeable at first. Small decisions made without me, small exclusions that felt easy to explain until they became a pattern. I swung my feet to the floor and sat there for a moment, letting that understanding settle fully. This was not a moment of weakness in them. This was a series of choices repeated over time until they became who they were now. I stood and walked toward the dresser, opening the top drawer where I kept old letters and photographs, things I had not looked at in years. I picked up one photo in particular, Jason, at 10 years old, standing in the backyard, holding a small trophy, his smile wide, his eyes bright, looking straight at me as if I was the only person in the world that mattered. I held that image for a moment longer than I intended before placing it back in the drawer gently, because that boy no longer existed, not in the way I remembered him, not in the way I needed him to. I closed the drawer and turned away from the past, because it no longer had anything to offer me that could change the present. I moved into the hallway and paused for a moment, listening again to the quiet, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt revealing, like a space that had finally been cleared of illusion. I walked into the living room and sat down in the same chair as the night before, the documents still resting on the table exactly where I had left them. I looked at them for a long moment before reaching forward and placing my hand on top of the stack again, not opening them, yet not rushing, because this was not about reacting, this was about understanding, and for the first time I understood completely. They had not stopped visiting because I was sick. They had stopped because they believed I no longer had anything to offer, and in that belief they had made the one mistake I had been quietly preparing for all along. I finally opened the documents that morning, not in a rush, not with trembling hands, but with a steady calm that had replaced everything else I had been feeling. The paper was smooth beneath my fingers as I turned the first page, slowly, my eyes moving across each line with care, not because I did not understand what was written, but because I wanted to let it settle completely. This was not something new. These were arrangements I had made years ago, quietly, carefully, with no intention of ever needing them under these circumstances. But life has a way of revealing why certain decisions are made long before their purpose becomes clear. I read through the details, the structure, the conditions, the protections, every line designed with intention, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility back. Then it had felt like preparation for something distant, something unlikely, but sitting there now, with the house silent around me, it no longer felt distant at all. I turned another page and paused briefly at a section I remembered discussing in detail. The condition was simple, clear, and impossible to misinterpret. Any direct heir who demonstrated neglect or abandonment during a time of medical need would forfeit their claim entirely. At the time I had agreed to it. Without much thought, I trusted that it would never apply, that my family would never allow something like that to become relevant, but now I could see it differently. Now it felt less like a precaution and more like a line that had already been crossed. I sat back in the chair for a moment, letting that realization settle fully. There was no confusion, no gray area, no need to reinterpret what had happened. They had not called, they had not visited, they had not even tried. And in doing so, they had made a decision that carried consequences they never considered. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, my hand resting on top of it for just a second, as if grounding myself in something real, something undeniable. This was not about punishment. This was not about proving anything to them. It was about acknowledging the truth of what had already taken place. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window, the morning light now brighter, filling the room with a clarity that matched my own thoughts. I looked out at the quiet street, the same familiar view, unchanged, yet everything about how I saw it felt different now. There was no waiting left in me, no expectation, no silent hope that things might return to what they once were. That version of reality had ended the moment they chose not to come. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the table, picking up the folder once more, this time with purpose, not hesitation. I knew what needed to be done, not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of alignment with the decisions that had already been made, both mine and theirs. I moved toward the hallway and into my room where my phone rested on the nightstand. I picked it up and scrolled to a number I had not needed to use in a long time. The name still there, unchanged, waiting for the moment it would matter again. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang once, then twice, before being answered. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper." The voice on the other end said, calm, professional, familiar. "How can I assist you today?" I allowed a small pause, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be clear in my own mind before I spoke. "I would like to review and update my arrangements," I said, my voice steady, controlled, carrying none of the uncertainty I might have felt before. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. "We can schedule a time to go over everything in detail." I looked down at the folder still in my hand, then back out toward the quiet hallway where nothing had changed, yet everything had already shifted. "No need to wait," I said quietly. "I am ready now." And in that moment, I understood something with complete certainty. This was not the beginning of a reaction. This was the continuation of a plan that had already been set in motion long before anyone realized it would be needed. The call did not take long to arrange. By the afternoon, I was sitting across from Mr. Bennett in his office, the same quiet space where decisions were made without emotion, without noise, just facts laid out clearly in front of those willing to see them. He greeted me with the same calm professionalism I remembered, but there was a difference in the way he looked at me now, not concern, not curiosity, but recognition, as if he understood that I was no longer here to ask questions. I was here to confirm something that had already been decided. "I reviewed your file this morning," he said as he opened the folder in front of him. "Everything is still structured exactly as you requested years ago." I nodded, once my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk as I looked at the documents spread between us and the conditions. I asked quietly, "They still apply?" He adjusted his glasses slightly and glanced down at the page before answering. "Yes, they do. They are very clearly defined and enforceable. There is no ambiguity." I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that settle, not because I needed clarification, but because I wanted to hear it spoken out loud. The confirmation carried a different weight when it came from someone else. "Then there is nothing to change," I said calmly. He paused for a moment, studying my expression as if expecting hesitation or doubt, but finding none. "You are certain?" he asked. "These provisions are significant. They cannot be reversed once acted upon." I met his gaze without flinching. "I am aware of that," I replied, my voice steady. "They were written for a reason, and that reason is no longer hypothetical." He nodded slowly and made a note on the document, his pen moving with the same deliberate precision I had always trusted In that case, everything remains as it is, and if the conditions have already been met, then the outcome will follow accordingly. I did not respond immediately. I simply looked at the page in front of me. The words, now carrying a finality they had never held before. This was not preparation anymore. This was execution, not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that required confrontation, but in a quiet alignment between what had been written and what had already occurred. I stood after a moment, smoothing my hands over the front of my sweater out of habit rather than necessity. Thank you, I said simply. He closed the folder and offered a small nod. If anything further is required, you know how to reach me. I turned and walked out of the office the same way I had entered, calm, measured, without urgency. The world outside had not changed. The streets were still busy. The air still carried the same early afternoon warmth. People moved through their routines, unaware of the shift that had just taken place in a quiet office behind closed doors. But I was aware, and that was enough. I returned home just before evening, the light softer, now stretching across the front yard in long quiet lines. As I stepped inside, the house felt the same as it had that morning, still silent. But now the silence carried something different, not emptiness, not uncertainty, but clarity. I set my keys down on the table and paused for a moment, listening, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the absence of them. And in that absence there was no disappointment left, no expectation, no waiting. I walked into the living room and sat down in the same chair, the documents now resting beside me. No longer something I needed to question, no longer something I needed to prepare for. Everything had already been decided, not by what I felt, not by what they might say later, but by what they had already done. And for the first time since I had realized they were not coming, I felt something settle completely into place, not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty, the kind that does not require anything from anyone else, the kind that stands on its own and does not move no matter what happens next. The next morning passed without interruption, the kind of stillness that would have once unsettled me, but now felt expected, almost necessary. I moved through the house, slowly, not out of weakness, but out of intention, each step measured, each action deliberate. I made coffee and let it sit untouched on the counter, the steam fading before I even thought about taking a sip. The phone remained where I had left it, silent, unchanged, no calls, no messages, and this time I did not check it more than once because there was nothing left to confirm. I already knew what their silence meant. I walked into the living room and sat down in the same chair again, the documents resting beside me, no longer something I needed to revisit, but something that had already fulfilled its purpose. I looked around the room at the furniture, the photographs, the quiet details of a life that had once felt shared, and realized that nothing here had been taken from me, not truly. What had changed was not ownership, but understanding. I leaned back slightly and closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to listen to the absence of expectation. There was no waiting left, no part of me holding on to the possibility that the door might open or that a voice might call out my name. That part of me had already stepped aside, replaced by something steadier, something that did not rely on anyone else to exist. I stood after a while and walked toward the window. The street outside, calm, unchanged. A car passed slowly, then disappeared at the end of the block, life continuing as it always does, without pause, without acknowledgement of the shifts happening inside quiet homes like mine. I turned away and walked into the kitchen, opening the cabinet and selecting a plate, placing it on the counter before realizing I was not hungry. I set it back without hesitation, small habits losing their purpose now that the reason behind them had changed. I moved through the hallway again, pausing briefly at the door to Jason's old room. I had not opened it in months, maybe longer, but today I did. The space inside was exactly as it had been left, clean, untouched, holding on to a version of time that no longer existed. I stepped in slowly, my eyes moving across the familiar objects, the desk, the chair, the shelf of books that had not been moved since he left. I walked over and ran my fingers lightly across the surface of the desk, the wood smooth beneath my hand, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the distance, not as loss, but as clarity. This room did not belong to him anymore, not in the way it once did, and the house itself did not belong to the idea of family I had been holding on to. It belonged to what was real, what could be proven, what had been protected long before any of this became visible. I stepped back into the hallway and closed the door gently behind me, returning to the living room where everything remained exactly as it should be. I sat down once more, my posture relaxed, my breathing even, and allowed the quiet to settle again. But this time it did not feel heavy, it felt complete, the kind of stillness that comes When there is nothing left unresolved, no unanswered questions, no uncertainty about what comes next, they had made their choice without realizing what it would cost, and I had already made mine long before they ever stopped coming, and now there was nothing left to prepare for, nothing left to question, only the simple truth that everything that mattered had already been decided, and I was exactly where I needed to be. I did not expect the knock. When it finally came, it was not loud, not urgent, just a simple sound against the door that carried more weight than anything else had in days. I looked up from the chair where I had been sitting, and for a moment I did not move, not out of fear, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to understand what it meant. Before I reacted, the house had been quiet for so long that even a small interruption felt unfamiliar. I stood slowly, my posture steady, and walked toward the door, each step measured, not rushed, not delayed. When I reached it, I paused for just a second, my hand resting lightly on the handle, as if the space between the inside and the outside needed to be acknowledged before it was crossed. I opened the door, and there they were, Jason standing slightly forward, Melissa just behind him, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled concern but did not quite reach her eyes. Mom, he said, his voice softer than it had been the last time we spoke, not confident, not distant, just uncertain, and that uncertainty told me everything I needed to know. I stepped back slightly, allowing the door to remain open, but I did not invite them in, not yet, not with words. Jason glanced past me into the house, as if expecting something to have changed, as if absence might have rearranged itself into something else while he was gone. We heard you were not feeling well. He continued, his tone measured, cautious, like someone testing the surface of something they did not fully understand. I nodded once, keeping my gaze steady on him. I was. I replied simply. Melissa stepped forward, then her movements smooth, controlled, her voice carrying that same practiced softness I had heard before. We should have come sooner, she said. Things have just been busy, but we wanted to check on you, make sure everything is okay. I listened without interrupting, not because I believed her, but because I recognized the pattern, the timing, the careful choice of words. None of it was spontaneous, none of it was genuine. It was constructed, adjusted to fit the moment they had walked into, not the one they had left behind. I stepped aside, then just enough for them to enter, not as an invitation, but as an allowance, and they moved inside with a quiet hesitation, their eyes scanning the room, taking in the stillness, the unchanged arrangement of everything, as if searching for signs that matched whatever expectation had brought them here. Jason walked toward the living room, slowly, his gaze lingering on the table where the documents still rested exactly where I had left them. His expression shifted slightly, something between curiosity and recognition, while Melissa's attention followed a moment later, her focus locking onto the same place, her composure tightening just enough to reveal that she understood more than she wanted to show. You look fine, Jason said after a moment, the words coming out almost before he could stop them, as if he had expected something else, something weaker, something that would confirm whatever assumption had been made. I met his eyes without reacting to the statement itself. I am fine, I answered, my voice calm, even, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. Melissa stepped closer to the table, now her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, her posture composed, but her attention fixed entirely on the documents. What is all this? She asked, her tone careful, but edged with something sharper beneath it. I did not move toward the table. I did not reach for the papers. I simply stood where I was and let the question remain unanswered for a moment, because the silence itself carried more meaning than any explanation I could give. They had come back not because I was sick, not because they cared, but because something had shifted, something they did not yet understand. And as I watched them stand there in a house that had not changed at all, I realized this was not a return. This was a realization beginning to take shape right in front of me. And for the first time since they walked through that door, they were no longer certain about why they were here or what they would find. And that uncertainty was exactly where everything I had prepared began to matter. I did not answer her question right away. I let the silence settle again, the same way I had before, because I had learned that silence reveals more than explanations ever could. Jason shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving between me and the documents as if trying to decide whether to speak or wait. Melissa did not move. Her attention remained fixed on the table, her posture controlled, but no longer entirely confident. It is just paperwork, I said finally, my voice calm, almost casual, as if the answer itself carried no urgency, but the way they both reacted told me it did. Jason took a step closer, his movements slower, now more deliberate. What kind of paperwork? He asked, And there was something different in his tone, not authority, not distance, but something closer to concern mixed with uncertainty. I walked toward the table, then not rushed, not hesitant, simply present, and placed my hand lightly on the edge of the folder without opening it, the kind that matters when people stop showing up. I said, and that was enough for the air in the room to shift. Melissa's fingers tightened slightly around the back of the chair, her eyes narrowing just enough to reveal that she understood more than she wanted to admit. We did not stop showing up, she said quickly, her voice smooth but no longer steady. We have just been busy. There is a difference. I looked at her, then not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm clarity that did not need to argue. There is a difference. I agreed quietly. But it does not change what happened. Jason exhaled softly, his hand running briefly through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times when he was younger, when he was unsure of what to say next. We are here now, he said, as if that alone could repair the absence that had already been established. I nodded, once acknowledging the statement without accepting it as resolution. Yes, you are, I replied, and let that be all. I said for a moment, because presence without intention means very little. Melissa stepped forward, then her attention returning to the folder, her voice lower, more controlled. You mentioned being prepared, she said. Prepared for what? I did not look away from her as I answered. For exactly this, I said simply, and the words landed with more weight than anything else in the room. Jason frowned slightly, his gaze shifting back to the documents, as if they now held an answer he had not considered before. I do not understand, he said quietly, and this time there was no defensiveness in his voice, just confusion, the kind that comes when something familiar no longer fits the way it used to. I rested my hand on the folder for a moment longer before lifting it slowly, not opening it, yet not revealing anything directly, because this was not about showing them everything all at once. It was about allowing them to feel the space between what they believed and what was actually true. You did not need to understand before, I said calmly, because you never asked the right questions. Melissa straightened slightly, her composure returning in small, controlled movements, as if she was trying to regain ground that had already begun to slip. Then, maybe you should explain it now, she said, and there it was again, that subtle attempt to guide the direction of the moment, to place herself back in control of something that no longer responded to her influence. I held her gaze without shifting. Some things do not need explanation, I said quietly. They need recognition. And I let the words settle without elaboration, because I could already see it happening, the realization moving slowly through both of them, not complete, not fully formed, but present enough to change the way they stood, the way they looked at me, the way they looked at the house itself, as if it no longer belonged to the version of reality they had been holding on to. And as I stood there with the folder in my hands, I understood that this moment was not about confrontation, it was about transition, the point where assumption begins to give way to truth. And once that shift begins, there is no way to return to what was believed. Before I finally opened the folder and placed it flat on the table between us, the paper making a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been in a room that quiet. Neither of them spoke as I turned the first page, slowly, my movements deliberate, not for effect, but because there was no reason to rush anymore. Everything that needed to be revealed would be revealed exactly as it was written. Jason leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the page, while Melissa remained still, her posture controlled, but her focus sharp, as if she was trying to read not just the words but the outcome before it fully reached her. This is a legal document, Jason said after a moment, his voice uncertain as he moved to the next page. And then the next. I nodded, once my hands resting lightly at my sides. It always has been, I replied calmly, and that was the truth. There was nothing new here, nothing created in response to what had happened. This had existed long before they chose to stay away, long before they decided I no longer mattered. Melissa stepped closer, then her eyes moving quickly across the lines, her expression tightening in small, controlled ways that she could no longer hide completely. This does not make sense, she said quietly, but there was tension beneath the words now, something sharper, something less composed. It makes perfect sense, I said, and for the first time I allowed a slight pause before continuing. If you understand the conditions. Jason stopped turning the pages, his hand resting on the document, as if holding it still might help him process what he was reading. What conditions? He asked, and this time there was no resistance in his voice, only confusion. I met his eyes steadily. The ones that apply when someone chooses not to be present when it matters most, I said, and the meaning settled into the space between us without needing further Explanation. Melissa's breath shifted just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to notice. You cannot expect that to apply here, she said quickly, her composure slipping for just a second. We did not abandon you, we just had responsibilities, we had things to manage. I looked at her then, not with anger, not with judgment, but with clarity that did not bend to explanation. You made your choices, I said quietly, and those choices have already been accounted for. Jason shook his head, slowly, his eyes returning to the document, as if searching for something that would undo what he was beginning to understand. This means, he started, but did not finish because the conclusion was already there. Written in plain language in terms that did not require interpretation. I did not complete the sentence for him. I did not need to. He already knew. Melissa stepped back slightly. Now her posture no longer controlled, her eyes moving from the paper to me and back again, as if trying to find a way to change something that had already been set long before she entered this house. There has to be something we can do, she said, her voice lower now, less certain, and that was the moment everything settled. Completely, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. The certainty was gone, replaced by recognition. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it once more, not to claim anything, but to acknowledge what had always been mine. There was, I said calmly, there was always something you could have done. I let the silence hold that truth for a moment before finishing. You could have come when I needed you. Jason lowered his gaze, his shoulders shifting as if something heavy had finally settled into place, while Melissa said nothing, her expression tightening into something unreadable, but no longer confident. I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I simply stood there, allowing the truth to remain exactly where it was, no longer hidden, no longer misunderstood. And in that stillness, I understood something with complete clarity. This was never about taking anything away from them. It was about revealing what they had already given up without realizing it. And now that they understood, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to change, only the quiet certainty of what had already been decided long before they chose to come back.